And the teacher was encouraging too. Um, that admonition that my instructor gave me kind of rang with me though, because I realized that if I continued down that road, I'd really be in big trouble. So I committed myself to art. And once getting out of school, I actually wanted to emulate him. I wanted to be a teacher like him. One of the things that he imparted upon me was the importance of the quality of life. And to the degree that art can actually influence that quality, it was incumbent upon me, given the life that I had led before, to try to maybe make up for that. I'm a very big believer in karma now, so there was a definite connection there. I was able to wiggle my way into Cal State Long Beach as an undergraduate, um, and it was in the late 60s. And as you can imagine, politics was pretty thick back in those days. I was a member of the Black Student Union, the Black Caucus. Everything was geared towards a much more political way of thinking. Um, Back in those days, we had the equivalent of Black Lives Matter and saying that Black was beautiful. Because when we said Black was beautiful, it encompassed a lot of different things. It encompassed the value that we placed on each other's lives and stuff like that. So I think to a large degree, that kind of informed the direction that I was going in. I also got into Eastern philosophies of meditation and stuff like that. I had been a devout Catholic for a number of years, and started to have second thoughts and reservations about Catholicism, and by extension, by religion pretty much across the board. I had gone to Catholic school. I had been taught by Dominican nuns for a while. I'd been taught by Sisters of St. Joseph's. I'd been taught by uh, Carmelite brothers. I had learned the Mass in Latin. I was an altar boy. I went through the whole schmear. And about 16, 17, I said, this isn't working for me. By the time I was in college, though, I was introduced to different forms of meditation. I started to get some of the same effects that I would get from the drugs that I had dabbled into through those Eastern philosophies. And to some degree, I started to incorporate that in ways in my art. And so as you see the art, you'll start to see certain through lines that come through that will remind you of possibly that meditative practice. Um, One of the things I realized getting out of undergraduate that, first of all, I went back to my old high school because I was talking to the principal about possibly teaching there. And after about 15 minutes at the school, I said, I can't teach these kids. I'll kill one of them. Because it was just pandemonium everywhere that I saw. So then getting out of undergraduate, I said, okay, well, I don't know any artists that are making a living doing this. And I was just naive enough to go around to try to market my slides and my images to galleries. And what would always strike me was I go to the gallery and they say, we really like your work, but it's so ethnic, which is kind of code for Black. And at the time, galleries didn't think that they could market that. And it was very disappointing because I had this notion somewhere in the back of my mind that racism didn't extend to the arts, but if anything, it was really hyper in the arts because art is so political on so many different levels. Um, it was very disappointing because I remember the whole time that I was an undergraduate and I'd be studying about the early masters and European Renaissance and all the rest of that stuff. It would never occur to me in terms of what the ethnicity of those people was. I was looking at their art and what it is that they were doing. And I thought that maybe the art world was enlightened enough to accept the experiences that I was going through as something that was valid, as something that should be recognized, it's something that should be exhibited. Um, in Los Angeles at the time, there were very, very few venues that were willing to show African American artists. Watts Towers being one of them, Brockman Gallery, which had a very notable history, being one of the others. There was a place called Contemporary Crafts that was started by Samela Lewis. Throughout my undergraduate and even extending after the undergraduate, I kept in touch with a guy named Frank Cummings III. who used to be the chair of the art department there at Cal State Fullerton. He kept me kind of like on the beam. It's interesting that throughout my career, there have always been these personalities. And when I start veering too much to the left or to the right, they kind of slap me back in place. And they're just old enough to have garnered the respect that I felt that they were due. And so I listened to them, and that listening really paid off. In undergraduate, in graduate school, which I, by the way, put off 14 years between undergraduate and graduate. And I approached it from a much more mature level. My graduate school advisor was a lady named Lydia Takeshita, who established LA Art Corps. And she's probably the single most influential person in my graduate school experience. One of the things that always struck me is that, with your teachers, oftentimes you want to see their work. And I would always pester her. It's like, Lydia, when are you going to show me your work? And she would always kind of demur, and I never got around to seeing her work. Finally, maybe I had been out of graduate school for 10 years and we were having dinner one night, and I said, Lydia, where's your work? How come you don't show anything? And she turned to me and she said, you are my work. And I started to realize that in so many instances, so many of the people that I knew that had been in her orbit were so influenced by what it is that she did and how she did it. It really was, it was the type of thing that made me want to kind of carry that tradition forward. And so I use that as kind of the guiding light in my teaching philosophy. And it's really been to my students' benefit. I'm very, very proud of a lot of people that I've had the ability to touch through teaching. I reflect on that quite often with some sense of pride, I must say. Anyway, going back, one of the things she told me is, she said, what you're pursuing is a passion. And I realized, yeah, you're right. And passions oftentimes are not supported to the degree that they need to be. So if you intend to do this, you need to work. You need to do some sort of job. Figure out a way to support your ability to support the passion. And so I've held a number of jobs, all of them, interestingly enough, except with the exception of one, was in some way related to the arts. When I first got out of school, I was doing window displays for a department store, which was a lot of fun, pretty rewarding. But I knew that wasn't the last place I was going to land. Then by default, I actually became the director of one of the county parks. And being in a position of authority, I could kind of massage things the way I wanted. So I started actually an outdoor exhibition program showing large sculptures of a lot of my friends who couldn't find galleries themselves and were just dying for some place to show. So I did a series of exhibitions called Giant Things. I initiated a mural program at the park. I was teaching classes myself. I was teaching yoga also. So it was very rewarding. And it gave me enough time to actually create my own work, which was still important. After that, I started working for a company called Rosie Greer's Giant Step. Rosie Greer's Giant Step was at one point the most successful job training program in the country. We were taking hardcore unemployed youth who had been referred to us by the probation department, and we were actually training them and placing them in the graphic design industry. We had the mandate to train and place 100 students a year. Our program was being looked at as an alternative to the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, which was a job program which wasn't very successful. A lot of people slipped through the cracks, stuff like that. But we had some of the most unconventional educational practices going forward, because a lot of these kids were from the streets. I knew enough about street language so that I could talk to them in their language, and I wouldn't let them punk me out, and they were trying to on a daily basis. We had a very little tolerance for any kind of back talk or insubordination. And because they were being trained and at the same time they were being paid, they had incentive to be there. So oftentimes for the slightest infraction, we would eliminate them. And what it did was it caused everybody else to look around and they says, ooh, these people are serious. If we're going to be serious, we got to get with the program. And so it caused some of them to change drastically in terms of their practice. Some of them went on to become, some of them went on to own their own businesses. One of them became the vice president of Art Linkletter Productions. I still see and talk to some of them every so often. And again, you know, it's really quite gratifying to see that happen. Anyway, after Ronald Reagan took office, the program was cut because it was getting significant amount of funds from the government. And then I started what was a really interesting program. I started working with LAPD, Los Angeles Police Department. I was a police artist for 13 years. And it couldn't have been more ironic, you know, given all the brushes that I had had with the law when I was growing up and being at the police academy. And I remember one time actually running into one of the officers who had arrested me when I was a teenager. He didn't remember me, but of course I'd never forget him. So I worked there for, like I said, 13 years. It was interesting work. I have, my opinion of police officers hasn't changed very much. I know there are very good ones, but I know that there's some that shouldn't be on job. While I was doing this, I was also working with UCLA in a program called Arts Reach. And what we would do is actually go into some of the prisons, primarily Chino men's and Chino women's. I was teaching watercolor in Chino women's. I was also teaching calligraphy, and my classes there were always packed because everybody wanted to do tats on each other. So it was very rewarding work, but after doing it for about 3 years, somebody who came to class one day was somebody who I used to run the streets with. And it shook me to the core, and I could not do it anymore after that. The prospect of running into more people that I had known from the streets was really very disconcerting. So I worked for LAPD for, as I said, 13 years, and then was able to escape and started working for the Cultural Affairs Department. The Watts Towers Arts Center had been around, you know, for years. John Otterbridge had been the director for 18 years prior to my coming in. For a short time, Willie Middlebrook, photographer, he was the director for, I think, about 6 months. And then I was there for 9 years, and it was 9 of the most trying years of my life. It gave me a quick wake-up call in terms of what community was about. I had to put aside all of my preconceived notions in terms of what I thought might work in community, and I had to really spend a lot of time listening. And it's one of the things that I tell my students, and also students that I've taught a class in community practice. I say community practice as opposed to social practice because I think the two are very different. One of the things that we start off is that when you go into a community, the first thing that you have to do is listen. A lot of times people go into communities and they don't listen. And particularly people in our field, they go in with this attitude that they're kind of like missionaries. And I tell them in a minute, missionaries get boiled and eaten. Don't even try it, okay? You have to go in, listen, find out what that community's priorities are, and then work with the people in the community to see how you can actually approach some of the problems that they're trying to address through an artistic practice. You have the ability to come up with creative ideas to do things. The exercise now has to be listening to the people that are there, listening, understanding what the limitations are that you have to work under, and finding ways to come up with creative solutions to those problems. If you approach community practice or social practice in any other way, it is doomed to failure. And so that's one of the things that I really impart to my students. It's essential that you listen. So that went on for a while. One of the things that I would have to do is put together an annual jazz concert and a Day of the Drum Festival. It had been a tradition there. I think when I got there, it had been in place for 25 years. It was one of the first jazz festivals actually in the city of Los Angeles, originally organized by some of the founders of Brockman Gallery, working with John Otterbridge. Um, I had a few kind of major hiccups. One of the things that I did was I brought in 5 Tibetan Buddhist monks to create one of the sand mandalas. I got a lot of blowback from the community that said I was trying to turn their children into Buddhists. And I had to work with that for a while. We had the Crips and the Bloods in there, and they would start putting red down next to blue, and there was a little bit of tension there. One of the things I should add is that the Watts Towers was always considered kind of neutral territory by the gangs. And I think they got wind of the fact that I used to work for the police department, and they thought that I was a police officer. I was a civilian employee, but they thought that I still had those connections. So on one level, they thought that I might bring the heat down on them. So I had to reach an accommodation with them really early. And I said, listen, as long as you don't sell drugs around here, as long as you don't terrorize people in this community, stuff like, you're not going to have any trouble from me. And it seemed to work, which I was really quite gratified at. We had a couple of situations where the kids were interested in creating a mural. And I said, well, the mural has to be neutral, whatever it is. And so they did a big graffiti mural that said, "Welcome to Watts." And it was really appreciated for a long time. And then after about a year, a rival gang moved into the neighborhood, and they started shooting up the mural, and they shot one of the kids, killed him. And then I was told by the department that I would have to have the mural painted out, but that I couldn't do it for 90 days because of a mural ordinance, which said that the mural had to, all opportunities had to be to document the mural, stuff like that. So for about 90 days, a couple of the kids that had worked on it actually had to move out of the neighborhood for fear of their lives. It was situations like that constantly had you a little bit off balance, and you always had to figure out, how do you adapt to this situation? And the situation could change on a daily basis. And so it was, from that standpoint, it was quite challenging. Another situation that came, and actually this was my downfall there, after basically consolidating the trust of the community, which took me, I would say, about 4 to 5 years. Towards the end of my tenure there, I entertained an exhibition by an artist who had been on staff. He was a very good teacher who had worked with me. His name is Alex Donis. Alex had a knack for doing work that was fairly controversial, and I was okay with that. He had done an exhibition called War, and it was life-size paintings of police officers dancing with gang members. When I saw it, I was immediately drawn to it because of the experiences that I had had in the police department. Interestingly enough, a lot of LAPD officers rolled up to see the show, and they loved it. Some of the gang members came by, they saw it, they loved it too. They said, "Oh, I know him. Yeah, that's the officer that arrested me." Stuff like that. So there's a lot of this going on. I said, "Oh, this is going to be pretty good." Well, there are about a half a dozen little old black ladies in Watts that said, "You take that down, and we'll take it down for you." And I tried to reason with them. I said, "Look, if you force me to take this exhibition down, you're going to give it the attention you don't want it to have." And they said, "We don't care. Take that down. We don't like the way our kids are being characterized." In the back of my mind, I'm believing that their reasoning was probably something else, but they knew it wasn't politically correct to go down that road. So this was the next best thing. Anyway, we struck the exhibition. There was a lot of brouhaha around it. The ACLU was calling me at home. National Coalition Against Censorship was on my back. We tried to meet with the artist. We were going to reason with them and said, "Look, let's take the exhibit down now. Let's organize some sort of dialogue behind the issues that the show brings up. And then maybe at some point in the future, we can remount it." And initially he was okay with that. but he started getting advice from a, a coalition. And at the point where he started naming the names of some of the old ladies that came out against the show, they said, you know, if he comes down here, we're going to do him great bodily harm because he's talking about my grandmother. So suffice to say, he became persona non grata there. I was pretty much sick of the whole thing, and I told my general manager at the time, it's like, I'm going to be looking for another job. She said, no, I don't want you to do that. If you do that, it's going to look like, if I transfer you right now, it's going to look like I'm punishing you, and I don't want that to happen. So I did another lame duck year there, and then became the director of 3 art centers in San Pedro and Bloomington, which for me was like a vacation. My office was right on the waterfront. You know, I watched the boats come in, stuff like that. Most of the programming there was on automatic pilot. The only thing is I didn't have any exhibitions that I needed to put up. After doing about 2 years there, she moved me to the Municipal Art Gallery at Barnsdall Park. And I was there for the remainder of my tenure with Cultural Affairs, which was another 6 years. I've been retired from the city of Los Angeles now for the last 11 years. But concurrently with all of this, I have been teaching. As Jennifer mentioned earlier, I teach at LACC. I teach design, intermediate drawing, experimental drawing. And I only teach one class because I've seen what teaching a full load can do to very creative people. Oftentimes it doesn't give you enough of an opportunity to do your own work. And the other thing is too, if you stay in it too long and you teach too many classes, your work starts to look like your students' work and vice versa. So I'm at a point now where I'm just about ready to bow out of teaching. I feel I've done as much as I'm willing to do, and it's time for me to get really selfish about myself and do my own work. And so that's kind of what I do. Getting to my own work, which I shall show you when I can share the screen here. Bear with me. Okay. Okay, are we seeing that? Yeah, good. Okay. So I'm not going to take you through everything I've done because that'll take a long time, but we'll do the last 20 years, okay, which is probably some of the more important work. I started off with a series in the late 90s. It was called Polytricks. These are a series of watercolors that I did. Again, you know, I was dealing with this whole idea of stick figures, and in this instance, it's called We the People. When they wrote this, did they really have you in mind? This was possible afternoon confrontations. It was really interesting. I was driving down Crenshaw Boulevard one day, and I passed by a Chevron station, and there was an altercation going on in the parking lot between a Korean owner and African-American customer. And as I was going down the street, about 30 minutes later, I came back and I saw the same corner. It had devolved into a fist fight. And I started to think about it just like who is actually pitting us against each other? We have some of the same issues in each of our communities. Who owns that gas station? Why do they let things like this happen? This happened also, you know, I was very cognizant of what had happened during the riots in '92. So I'm sorry, no, it was the riots that happened after Rodney King. So I was thinking about that whole situation while this was going on. Politics, the Democratic Party has always felt it's had a lock on the African-American community. And the thing is, we've never really demanded anything from the Democratic Party. And now it's about time that those things become due. For those African-Americans that decided that they were going to, you know, weather the storm and join the Republican Party, it's like it said, beware the elephant, because he'll screw you too. These are done mostly using Dr. Martin's dyes, which anybody that is familiar with that realizes that that is a medium that is pretty fugitive. A lot of the colors have faded on these things. It was a lesson that I learned. So then let's go up to the year 2000. One of the things that struck me was that the specter of stereotypes, particularly of African Americans, is something that has haunted us for a long time. My meditative practice, one of the things that we talk about is what exists in the subconscious. And in this instance, it's the fact that images of people in blackface, most African Americans have such a visceral reaction to it because it's such an affront. It reminded me that possibly we need to figure out a different way to engage these things in order to take the power away from them. So I was taking vintage photographs, mostly of white people in blackface, and overprinting them with text in the form of an eye examination chart that would then cause the message to be seen in a different context. So in this one, and oftentimes the text that I would use would be from hip hop and rap. One of the things that I found in my research was at the time that blackface minstrelsy was so popular, it was considered the most most pervasive musical art form in the world. And to some degree, hip hop now probably has that same stature. So there are definitely correlations between hip hop and minstrel culture. This one says authenticity implied, not guaranteed. Understand, when I first started doing this work, my mother thought I had lost my mind because these things are really considered taboo. You should bury these things as far down as you possibly can. But one of the things that I do learn in my meditative practice is that if you bury something, continually bury it, if you refuse to acknowledge it, it has ways of coming out and biting you in ways you have no control over. So it's like I realized that while this was painful on a lot of levels, it was something that needed to happen. It's really kind of akin to what you're doing is you're reappropriating the appropriated, and in that exercise, what you do is actually neutralize it. So I wasn't all that interested in selling it. Again, going back to that whole idea of working a job to support your passion, really stimulate dialogue on the subject. And in that regard, it was wildly popular. So I did a series of serigraphs. After a while, I actually moved into inkjet printing them because I wanted to make sure that I was able to get the colors and the kind of the sepia tones of the photographs a little bit more accurate. This says, don't hate the player, hate the game. This says, true power is in the withholding. It says, so what's up with this shit? This just says colored. Sometimes we become what we hate. This one kind of speaks for itself. The things about the genre of blackface minstrelsy is that oftentimes people would be in blackface in drag. And the idea was to demean the mother figure, because by demeaning the mother figure, you actually then by extension get to the entire race. I did a series of lenticulars too. The lenticulars are where you look at something straight on and you see one image, and then when you move to the side, it actually flips. So everything black turns white, everything white turns black. It's kind of an expensive process, but it's pretty effective. Good example is when you move to the side of one image, it kind of goes to a white thing. Things I was also trying to emphasize was the fact that those people that you saw in those pictures were not black. They were something else. And interestingly enough, this series, like I said, was mostly 20 years ago. But initially, as I said, Black people had a lot of problem with it. Now it seems that more white people have problems with this work than in the past, because I think what's happening is they're realizing it's not so much about us as it is about them. This was kind of, I did a series of experimental pieces. This was using Coroplast, Coroplast corrugated plastic. What I do is actually drill holes in the back of it, take a syringe and inject paint into it. And you can build this up in several layers. And one of the things I was trying to emphasize in this, of course, was the different layers of consciousness. You know, what exists on the conscious level, what is actually at this being. Each time you do your meditative practice, you actually start to expunge some of those more troubling things that exist in the subconscious. This was an interesting collaboration between two artists from CalArts. One was named Jason White, and the other was named Aaron White. Neither one of them was white, and they weren't related. But they did a play that was called The Dance, which you can still see excerpts of it on YouTube. The play was about the history of minstrelsy. And I asked them if I could actually take their photographs one night when they were in makeup before the performance. And they were very careful, but they said, you know, we can do this. You can make art out of it, but I hope that you would vet very carefully who you sell that art to if you sell it. And I actually told them, I said, I'm not really too interested in selling it. I want to basically use this as a lesson. So what happens is that you'll see their picture in the lower, in this instance, of the lower left-hand corner, but the piece itself is on really highly polished plexiglass. So when you're looking at it, you're actually seeing your own reflection in the piece. And you get caught up in this space. Is like, is he looking at me? Am I looking at him? Is my reaction to him what I think it should be or what other people might think it should be? There are a whole host of things that happen with these pieces. I came across a book, and the book was about how you put together a minstrel show. And they had these characters in the book, which I decided to put on tambourines. The obvious thing is, what do you do with the tambourine? You beat it. And in this instance, you know, you're inflicting punishment on these caricatures. So then I started kind of looking at some of the things that were associated with this stereotype. And one of the things that came to mind was watermelon. A lot of people don't know the history of watermelon. Originally, it came from the Nile Valley, and caravans took it on camel or whatever across the Sahara to Western Africa, where it became wildly popular. It would grow under almost any circumstances, and it would grow in abundance. Now, the curious thing is, when watermelon showed up in the United States, it was about 1622. Now, there's no manifest on any ship that has a record of them storing watermelon. And you think about it, watermelon takes up a lot of space. You know, 4 or 5 watermelons, you could put another slave there. Slave is worth a lot more than watermelon, so, you know, watermelon loses out. But the question still begs, how did it get here? Well, my research turned up that watermelon seeds can actually stay in your gut for up to 3 months. And so it's entirely possible that watermelon might have been excreted somewhere here in a completely fertilized matrix, and it thrived in the United States. So I call this piece Stowaways. This is Budget Doll. Budget Doll, actually, I frequent the swap meets quite often. Long Beach is one of the best. I came across this kind of a cutout wooden doll that was black, and they used binder hole protectors for the eyes and for the mouth. And I said, oh, that's an interesting way to use the stereotypes. So I took it home. One of my mother's friends came by the studio and saw this piece and she said, where'd you get that? I said, the swap meet. She said, Oh, we used to have those when I was a kid. My father knew that we couldn't afford to buy dolls or anything like that, so he would cut these things out of wood, paint them black. We'd spend the whole year making clothes for these things, and it kept us busy. So I said, well, so it wasn't about the stereotype. No, not all. So consequently, budget doll. This is colored cotton. One of the things that when you look over a field of flowers or anything into infinity, it is actually kind of a perfect metaphor for the whole idea of meditation. And so these cotton balls that happen here, I started to equate them with the mantra that you use in meditation. And you start counting these things and you go back until the point where you actually lose count, and then you actually go into kind of a different mental state. It's a motif that I've repeated quite a bit. It's what's happened over the years is that the process of creating this has actually become, to me, more important than the final outcome. So, I go into a different state of consciousness when I'm working on these things. They're pretty time consuming. Pieces take anywhere from a month to 3 months. But it all goes along with my program to do fewer pieces but spend longer on them. And consequently, you have less inventory. So if you don't sell these things, it's okay. This is called Consequences of an Unmet Quota. Again, going back to the whole idea of cotton. During slavery, if you didn't meet your quota picking cotton, you were subject to punishment. And sometimes that punishment would be the whip. And the interesting thing is that if you get blood on cotton, you can't sell it. This is called Tar Baby's Acres. This is what would happen if Tar Baby ran through a field of cotton. Going back into like the coroplast things that I was doing, this is called Paul Robeson's Othello. Paul Robeson, actor, singer, somebody who I had a great deal of admiration for. If you ever read up on his political thinking, it's pretty enlightening. Again, dealing with things that are one on the surface, things that are further deeper into the subconscious. This is called Bones for Mr. Jones. One of the musical instruments that a lot of the minstrels used to use was actually cow bones, where they'd click them together and they'd sound kind of like castanets. Magic. As you can see, I had a lot of fun with this. This is just cut out paper. Sometimes I'd be sitting in meetings. In arts administration, you have a tendency to have to sit in a lot of meetings. And under the table, I would be cutting these things out kind of spontaneously. And I'd save them and use them in art pieces. It was always funny because we get up from the meeting, there's always be a trail of paper behind me, and people were wondering, like, what the hell was he doing down there? So then I started looking at cartoon characters, because the natural evolution of what was happening with Black minstrel shows actually started to manifest itself in a lot of cartoons that were done in the 30s and 40s and even on up into the 70s. This was a character from a Ralph Bakshi cartoon that was called Coonskin. At the time that it came out, it was roundly criticized by the NAACP and a lot of other organizations. But it's interesting, in later years, it's actually been reevaluated, and it's starting to be recognized as kind of a parody and of the blaxploitation films of the 1970s. The idea here is that you take a character and you put him out in the field and you let him pop as many as he wants to, he won't hurt him. A 1930s cartoon where they took a rooster, and they used him to characterize Cowboy. Character called by George Powell in the 1940s. A lot of these things are still available on YouTube. I would take a look at them if you would. This was one that actually I grew up with, thinking it's not that bad, because Professor Scarecrow was usually the smartest person in the room. Everybody's familiar with the crows from Dumbo. This was a sketch that was actually used to create embroideries. I did a series of these. These were in 2005. No, I'm sorry, 2021, somewhere around there. This is called Little Black Sambo Joins the Boy Scouts. Um, what's the motto of the Boy Scouts is be prepared. And in this instance, Little Black Sambo's strapped, so he's ready to protect himself. This is probably this is the most racist cartoon I have ever seen. It goes by the title Cold Black and the Seven Dwarves. And this is one of the characters from that. It's one of what was called the Band 11. There were 11 cartoons that were deemed by the industry to be so racist as to be taken out of distribution. And so some of them are still available on YouTube, but a lot of them have just gone away. I'm always walking a very thin line when I do this stuff because I run the risk of the movie studios coming after me, possibly because I'm, appropriating these images. So far, it hasn't happened. I do firmly believe that a lot of the movie studios don't want to know that they were ever associated with this stuff. So, so far, so good. Even Bugs Bunny was characterized in blackface. Mr. Popo, those of you with Dragon Ball knowledge know he was the smartest person in the room too. Duke the Crow, another Ralph Bakshi character. This is a mural that was up on the side of Plaza de la Raza for a while. These were taken from books on instructions on how to put together minstrel shows. They're based on 19th century engravings. Again, you'll see this kind of starburst here, which I've used to characterize the mantra. This is called class warfare. We're dealing with the stratifications within the African-American community between light skin, dark skin, people that are subjected to the paper bag test, all kinds of things like that. It's something that I thought had gone away, but sometimes when I'm talking to my students and even talking to their contemporaries, they tell me that no, there's still a lot of that going on. This is called Frankie's Nightmare. This was a short-lived series. It was called Anger Management. In this instance, it's called Anger Mismanagement. I thought this was intriguing. I came across a 19th century ad that had this character in it. His expression of both grimacing and smiling and at the same time frowning at the same time. This was, I chose to use the textbook definition for motherfucker. A lot of people are only familiar with one definition for it, which is basically a vile character of some sort. But the second definition, which was most interesting, was that it is a term of a compliment actually that's given to jazz musicians. Like he was a badass motherfucker. This is anger management number 2. That's anger management number 1. I spent some time in Brazil. I was part of a residency program that was there. It's called Sacatar. I was there for 3 months, and I was able to actually witness a lot of the ceremonies that go back to the early African religions. And one of the things that I witnessed was something called Igungun. These Iguns, I was taken to a theatre one night about 9 o'clock. We were locked in this place with 250 people. And over the course of 16 hours, these people would come out in these costumes. They were called Iguns. They would be giving blessings, and everybody wanted to get close to them for the blessing, but they could turn on a dime and they would rush the crowd. And if an Igun touched you, you were actually marked for death. The death could be any number of things. It could be physical, it could be spiritual, it could be all kinds of things. But I was not a believer, but I have a healthy respect for other people's beliefs. People have been known to walk out of these ceremonies, get hit by cars, struck by lightning, have heart attacks, stuff like that. But in this instance, this is called the Agoon that saved Florida. It was right after the Trayvon Martin killing. And I felt that there was some outside power that needed to intervene to protect people in Florida. This is called Pepto-Punk Angel. This again deals with the whole idea of the Agoon, deals with medicine and how medicine can work these incredible miracles. But again, there's that duality. Sometimes the side effects can kill you. This is the police. It's called For the Price of a Bullet. They're there to protect and serve, but sometimes they don't do that. This is called I Sing the Body Technic. It deals with the whole idea of technology, which is this incredible blessing. It can make things a lot easier, but it's at the expense of knowledge, and you forget how to do certain things. I did another residency at the McColl Center for Art Plus Innovation in Charlotte, North Carolina, and it was during the summer when the police had killed a young Black man again. The night that it happened, there was a demonstration about 6 blocks away from me. My mother called me. She said, "Don't get yourself involved in any of that." I said, "Don't worry." The next night, the demonstration was on my doorstep. The police had one megaphone. The demonstrators had another. They needed an intermediary. And in so many instances, these Agoons are sometimes seen as intermediaries. And so that's why I came up with this image. This is again going into that, what I was telling you about process being more important than the final outcome. This was called CC2, CC standing for cosmic consciousness, which is an aspiration that we try to get to in the course of meditation. This is CC1. All this is done on Duralar, which is kind of like a drafting film. It's translucent. So all the black marks are actually made on the surface, and all the color actually is done from the back. This is CC3. This deals with the Zong massacre. As of late, I've been doing a lot of research into little known stories about people from the African diaspora. This was a particular case where they were transporting slaves from Africa to Jamaica, and the captain had not put enough provisions aside to sustain the cargo. He threw 130 people overboard. And then when he gets to Jamaica, he tries to file an insurance claim for the loss. The insurance claim was denied. When he gets back to England, he again tries to file the insurance claim, which was denied again. But the publicity around the case actually gave rise to the abolitionist movement in England. And as a result, within 20 years, slavery was abolished in the English Empire. Now, this was something that struck me very much like in old engravings. And one of the things I found was that on currency, they didn't use us as stereotypes. They actually, even though we were slaves and we were doing their work, we were characterized with some sense of dignity. So this is a series called On the Money. And then I moved into what I'm doing now, which is the Black Madonna, and again, going back into these little known stories about some of these saintly figures. This was the first Black Madonna, which I pretty much think was a failure, but it taught me a lot. And so I'm still kind of working through some of the problems that this one brought up. This was a little bit more successful. This show was just at the William Turner Gallery in Santa Monica, and it was the most successful exhibition I've ever had, quite frankly. What I'm doing in this is I'm taking classical photographs, or classical paintings rather, of the Madonna and Child, done by, in most instances, Renaissance artists, Bellini, Raphael, stuff like that. And I'm turning them black because there's a certain significance to the Black Madonna that really goes back to the Renaissance and the whole idea of new beginnings. There are over 500 Black Madonnas in France alone. and they're prayed to for different reasons. And I remember, going back to my Catholicism, how important it was to, pray to the Madonna. So I'm juxtaposing that with images of mostly white supremacists that are being eliminated on some level. And what it deals with is it's not so much the revenge fantasy as it is basically a characterization of what most white supremacists are bound up in, which is the whole idea of fear. It's fear of retribution. It's fear based out of guilt for how they treated people throughout the world, quite frankly. And so, again, going back to the idea of what I was trying to accomplish with the blackface, you have to confront yourself with your fears in order to get over them. And so I look at this as being somewhat therapeutic work, and it's gained some acceptance. Um, I know that it probably again will bother some people, and I'm okay with that. If art doesn't bother you, then it's not doing its job. This is called Mississippi Cookout. This is called Mistaken Identity. This is based on a Bellini piece. These are done in acrylic, and I use gold leaf. Um, I've become a lot better at gold leaf as time has gone on. This is called Burning Down the House. This is based on the Madonna by Leonardo da Vinci. This is called Charlie Cha Cha. Consequences. This is called Distress. In the military, whenever you see the American flag in the upside down position, you know that there is distress. Given some of what we've been through recently, I think that this was particularly apropos. This was a character I was introduced to when I was in Brazil. Uh, Her name is Anastasia. Anastasia is considered by most Brazilians to be a saint, but the Catholic Church will not canonize her, and they've ordered all of her images removed. But there are a number of miracles that have been attributed to her. It's said that her mistress was very jealous of her beauty, and as a result, put this muzzle on her to more or less detract. Um, as a result, what happened is the muzzle started to actually bite into her skin, and she developed tetanus and passed away. But before she passed away, she actually laid hands on the mistress's son and healed him and forgave them for everything that they had done. This is called Enlignum Phoenix, which in Latin translates to unfortunate wood. It's called the French solution. This is called Wheelabout. This is called Mercy Deferred. So then I did a couple of pieces in celebration of the gang truce. The truce between the Crips and the Bloods has been pretty much holding for about the last 30 years. I mean, my interactions with them, particularly during the time I worked in Watts, and also when I was growing up dealing with some of the gangs in my neighborhood, I understand that the motivation comes from a need for unconditional love. And so I also understood how much strength it took for them to both come to the conclusion that they weren't each other's enemies. And I thought it needed to be celebrated in some sort of way. So in the background, I have the atomic explosion, which symbolized the war that they were all involved in at one time or another. And again, in the middle, there's this figure that is the intermediary that's also based on the whole idea of the Agun. This is called Collateral, and it deals with all the people who died as a result of getting caught in gunfire between the two rival gangs. There were a lot of people that had no business dying, but they were in the wrong place at the wrong time that day. And so what I've done is I've characterized both of the gangs on either side. They're all in their underwear because I wanted to show how vulnerable they were, particularly given what we've seen in terms of what's happening contemporaneously. Black youth are being attacked and they're under fire and they're vulnerable. You know, it was very interesting too when I was a few years ago. We were at a dinner party and it went around the table and people said, well, what did you expect to be doing by the time you were 21? And I said, I didn't think I was going to be alive. And so, in this country, I shouldn't have to think like that. And I would hope that we could at some point get beyond all of that. So that's kind of where this is going. The tennis shoes that you see here, they represent the shoes of all the people that were caught in as collateral damage. And that is it.
Wow, thank you so much, Mark, for visiting my class. My students are so blessed to have you talk today. And so a lot of them are putting their questions in the chat, but I would like to just tell you that one of the things that's wonderful about being an artist living in this region is that you get to meet your heroes. And so I have taught Mark's work in my classes for about 17 years.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And so I've always loved your work, and I've always, I love the complexity of your paintings, your use of the black mark and line, and then how full of metaphor and meaning each piece is. And so it's fun to look at with students because there's so much stuff going on that you can pick apart. So I just wanted to thank you for coming. He came to my show a year ago and I said, oh my God, I'm so excited to meet you. I'm such a big fan. And you had this look on your face like, who is this woman? But I really appreciate you saying yes today, because it's one of the, it's really an honor to get to know more about you and to interact with you and then to introduce you to my students. So thank you so much for being here. I'm going to just start reading the students' questions. And students, if you want to just jump in and put questions in the chat, I'll try to keep up with them. But I'm going to start with the students that put their questions in first. Let's see, this is from Vera Castaneda. What kind of meditative practices would you recommend for a beginner?
Well, that's interesting. The thing about it is I belong to, and I don't talk about this generally. I usually just talk about meditation. I started off with transcendental meditation. The reason I don't identify it is because I have real issues with what the organization has become. Years ago when the Maharishi was here, he intended for everybody to have access to some form of meditation. His attitude was that whatever you do, if you can get 10% of the world's population into some sort of consciousness raising program, that 10% can affect the other 90%. And so, he would say, you got to find your own vehicle to get there, and he did compare it to a vehicle. He says some people travel in a Rolls Royce and some people travel in a Volkswagen, some people travel in a Ford, but you all get there some sort of way. So, it's like when you talk Hare Krishna is, that's a mantra that people repeat. When you say the rosary, the Hail Marys, that is a mantra that people, when you go to Nichiren Shoshu and, you go Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, these are all different things to raise people's consciousness. Just like religion, you have to go and explore and find the one that's more conducive to your life.
I love the way you talked about counting the cotton in the fields and how that becomes a visual meditation. That was really a wonderful moment in the lecture. Thank you for sharing that with us. This is a really interesting question. This is from Oscar Leon. In the culture of troubled youth, you oftentimes see a lot of suppressed emotions. Do you feel that's why art is so effective in helping youth transition back into public life?
Yeah, because one of the things that's missing is that whole idea of self-expression. Mm-hmm. When I was living with my father, and believe me, my father kind of ruled the roost. There was very little room for self-expression in his household. When I was able to do those things, it was liberating. Mm-hmm. I was able to tell my story, and nobody can take that away from you. Nobody can make you compromise on that because it's coming from a place that's very deep in the soul. And every time you do that, what you're doing is you're dipping into this well that's very, very positive. And every time you dip into that well, you bring a little bit more of that positivity up to the surface. And then it manifests itself in your conscious life. And whereas you might say, there was a day when I was willing to do this, even though I knew it was wrong, you may wake up one morning and you say, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that anymore. And so, I think that if you can get more young people involved in some sort of thing like this, one of the things I did, a much earlier series of work where I was dealing with genealogy, and we were taking, again, pretty hardcore youth, and we're saying, you need to talk to your grandmother, or you need to talk to your grandfather. And they say, why? We don't have anything in common. I said, the fact that you're here means you had something in common. You need to go and question them because they're a wealth of knowledge. And so we gave them a half a dozen questions to go and ask their grandparents. And with some of them, they started to realize the sacrifice that their grandparents had to go through to get them to this point. And it made a difference in them because they realized they had a responsibility to continue in that kind of tradition. And so, in the same way, I kind of liken it to a spiritual practice, having that talk with your forebears to actually figure out different ways of approaching life. We wouldn't get through to all of them, but if we got through the 3 or 4 of them, that was 3 or 4 more than before. And we may have saved some lives.
That's such a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing that. This is from Julissa Ponce. When you were working for LAPD, what do you feel was the most valuable thing you learned from that 13 years of experience? And what was the toughest thing that happened, or what was the hardest thing you heard in the community, when you were doing that?
Well, it's really interesting. I did a lot of graphic work and stuff like that. In the 13 years that I worked for them, there's only one thing that I was able to put in my portfolio because so much of the work was classified. Mm-hmm. There was an experience I had one time where I was working at the academy, which if you have to work for the LAPD, that's the only place to work. It's like a country club. Okay. They had a bar up there for a long time. They didn't close till midnight. But one of the things that struck me, one of the classes that came through, there was a girl in the class who I had gone to high school with. And I pulled her aside one time. I said, why are you here? Why are you doing this? And she says, I really want to change the image of the department in the community. And I feel that I'm best able to do that. It's like, because I can bring some compassion to the job and stuff like that. So I ran into her about 3 years later. I said, so how's it going with that? And she had this glazed look in her eyes, like you could tell that she had been completely jaded. And I said, you had a lot of aspirations when we first talked about this. And she said, yeah, but Mark, when you walk up to the side of the car, you don't know if you're going to go home that day. So you have to walk up to the side of the car ready for whatever may happen and almost anticipating that it could be the worst. It's not going to happen most of the time, but that anticipation and being on that edge will change your personality over a while. And I said, I understand, but that's not the reason you got in this department. And about 3 weeks later, she quit.
Wow. That's powerful. Yeah, a couple of students asked questions very similar to Jalissa's. So did Malia. That's fascinating to hear that story. Here's another question. Let's see. That was, let me make sure I ask a new one. Oh, this one, Marina Avalos. From an educational standpoint, do you think it's better for images such as Popo from Dragon Ball or the crows from Dumbo to be completely erased or to be given acknowledgement and discussed in class?
They need to be given acknowledgement and discussed in class.
Yeah, I had a feeling you'd say that.
I mean, believe me, I know that the your visceral reaction to it is that these things should be buried. You got to put them away. You got to forget about its past, its history. But that's the thing. It's history. It's history. And unless you acknowledge that dark part of history, you will, believe me, it will manifest itself in ways you have no control over. I'm a very, very big believer in the law of cause and effect and karma. Not divulging too many secrets, but in my past, my pseudo criminal past, I remember my roommate and I used to steal bicycles. we'd go to like, places like Occidental and some of the little higher end schools, and we steal bicycles and we bring the bicycles back and we sell them, and we take that money and we buy weed and we pay for books and go through college. Okay, so one of the things that happened is after I got out of school, I hadn't had enough sense to steal a bicycle for myself. I decided to buy a bicycle, and within 2 weeks it was stolen. And so I bought another bicycle, and then about a month later it was stolen. The first 5 bicycles that I bought after I got out of college were stolen. I started buying cheaper bicycles.
Wow, that's terrific. Oh my God, that's a life lesson right there, huh?
But the thing is, it just emphasized that whole idea of karma. If you do those things, it's going to come back at you again in ways that you cannot anticipate, stuff like that. So the whole idea of burying anything to that degree doesn't do anybody any good. One of the things about the understanding that most young African Americans had when I was doing the Black Atchis series was that, to a large degree, if this is the way that I have been characterized for so many decades, it gives me a better understanding of why people are dealing with me the way they are now. And so from that standpoint, it really serves an important lesson. I mean, I came very late to the understanding of what racism was, because when I was my father was in the service, he had some rank. He was a colonel. And to some degree that insulates you from a lot of that stuff. So I didn't really understand what it was until I was about 11 years old. I didn't know what the word nigger was. Okay, that's something that I had to be worried about. And so, when I was an undergraduate, particularly, Black Power movement, I was reminded of just how insidious this whole thing is. I was a freshman. I was taking a painting class at Cal State Long Beach. And the instructor said, "We don't have enough room in my classroom for you. So we're going to put you in this classroom across the hall. I'll check on you every so often to make sure you're doing what it is that you're supposed to be doing." And interestingly enough, a lot of times I'd be left out of critiques. And to this day, I can only imagine what I must have missed by a lot of that. But now looking back on it, understanding exactly why he did what it is that he did, because he considered having somebody Black in his class was going to cause trouble. And he didn't want to confront it.
It's so sad.
Yeah.
Horrible. Yeah. This question is from Victoria Castillo. You said that it was hard getting into galleries because your work was seen as too ethnic. Do you feel that online platforms have helped with this? And how do you compare having an online following with being an artist in a traditional gallery?
That's an important question. Having a digital presence is really important. But one of the things I also, hit me with the last part of that question again.
Let's see. I moved on. Okay. How do you compare having an online following with being in a traditional gallery?
Yeah. See, so traditional galleries are important from the standpoint that they have, they're essential in the food chain, really. If you look at it, and I think CalArts taught me this better than anything else, the food chain consists of artists that are creating the work, critics that write about the artists, galleries that represent what the critics write to some degree and represent the artists, and then the museums. What happens is the writer working with the gallery promotes the artist. The artist then becomes a commodity for the museum. All right. So there's that important link that galleries do serve. There's a growing there's growing attention that's being given to those digital platforms. And I know some artists who only sell online. But the thing too is that the sustainability of that type of model is still in question. We don't know how much longer that goes up, because people's tastes are very fickle. And what might work one year may not work the next year. And if you're depending on that to survive, you're in trouble. Whereas a gallery might be able to help you kind of solidify that type of following, and might give you some degree of security. I mean, it took me years to finally get a gallery to represent me. And when they did, it was not what I thought it could be or should be. This last exhibition that I had with the William Turner Gallery has been my most successful, and we're kind of in negotiations now to see whether or not representation will happen as a result of it. The other side of that, though, is that some people don't know how to handle representation, and what it can do sometimes is pollute the creative instincts in a way that maybe might keep you from realizing your best potential.
Mhm.
You know, it's a much longer that I need.
Yeah, it's a big question. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't think that's a good.
You're cutting out a little bit on me, so I'm hearing just a little bit of what you said toward the end. So I'm sorry if I'm not seeming in contact with what you said, or it doesn't relate to closely enough to what you said. I apologize.
That's okay.
Are you
If I'm
moving to a
cutting out
better
with you, I'm cutting
location?
out with everybody else too. I'm moving to a place closer to the modem.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's settle down. Let's see. This is from Mylene Gonzalez. Earlier, you mentioned that when you would go into communities, the first thing you have to do is listen. Have you ever been to a community where there was something hard to listen to, or something you didn't think would impact you? I guess I hope this question makes sense from Mylene.
Well, initially when you go into a community, you're looked at like you have two heads because you're an artist, and there's a certain stereotypical vision of what an artist is supposed to be.
Mhm.
So you have to sometimes put up with people's ire because they look at you as being some sort of elitist. And it's difficult to get beyond that. It helps if you grew up in that community and if you had a lot of interaction with people over an extended period of time. But I've seen some remarkable failures, particularly when it comes to things like community practice and social practice. Not to name any names, but somebody tried to establish a nonprofit in Watts to kind of work with the community on some levels, but they came in again with a very dictatorial attitude, and they took a lot of liberties and they made a lot of assumptions, and as a result, they were eventually and politely asked to leave. you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I've always thought that that's a fascinating, what even as the language, that there's the distinction between community-based practice and social practice. I always wonder when somebody is very adamant that their social practice, why they're so afraid to be associated with that word community. That there seems to be an element of racism there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that word community conjures up all kinds of things. People put their own labels on it. People have a different understanding of what community is.
Mhm.
And sometimes what has to happen is that you have to readjust your vision of what a community is when you are start to work in that situation.
Yeah.
I just when I was at CalArts, we actually had the students put together a primer on things, do's and don'ts in community if you choose to go into community practice. Because not everybody is cut out for it. They may have this, idea that's altruistic, they're going to bring high culture to a community and stuff like that. And it doesn't always work.
Yeah. You work a lot with side street projects. Could you talk a little bit about what they do and why you work with them? And you're on the board, right? Is that correct?
Yeah. I was, when I was at Watts Towers, we were the first partners with Side Street Project. And this is, they have a series of school buses, and the buses have been gutted and fitted out with woodworking stations. And we can actually drive the bus to a school, bring on a number, I think we can handle 12 or 14 students at a time. They're on the bus working in wood. They leave the bus with a completed project in about an hour, hour and a half. And so, we've been very, very lucky in that we've been able to sign on with some of the school districts, Pasadena Unified School District in particular. And those contracts kind of help sustain us. On top of that, we have services for artists. So we're Artist Resource Center. In some instances, I've been known to actually review people's grant proposals and stuff like that, so that, they kind of come to it with a little bit more professionalism. Oftentimes as artists, we don't concentrate on some of those things. And as a result, we're not speaking that language. And, we need help. We need people that are willing to take a look at what it is that we've done and say, this will fly or this won't fly. And so that's one of the things that we try to do also.
Yeah, I've always really liked side street projects for several reasons. I think woodworking is such a big element missing from public schools. A lot of industrial arts have been eliminated from schools. And that's such an important, I think, aspect for people who are three-dimensional thinkers to tap into their creative energy. It's such a wonderful program. Also, when I first moved to LA, that was the only way you could get a projector, was to join side street projects. And then they checked out audiovisual equipment to artists. And I didn't have any money to buy a projector, or, that was a big expensive. I mean, at one time, projectors were like $3,000. They were big, expensive things. And so if you remember, you could rent one or borrow one, and it was basically free. It's just it's always been an organization that I've, been excited to give to, because you just do so many wonderful things for that community and for all of us, really. It's awesome.
Yeah, we're proud of what it is that we've been able to accomplish. And, even during the pandemic, we've been able to actually do a lot of kind of, impact on school children and stuff like that. So we're really
awesome. And I think we got one last one here. This is Oscar again. Hearing your experiences of racism seems so disconnected from the ideals of today, but it's sobering to hear that it happened not so long ago. It reminds us that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. Thank you for your stories. I guess that was just a generic, a wonderful thank you from Oscar. Thank you. And then this is a question from the student newspaper. We should ask this one, huh? It's from Jessica Aitken. I'm covering this for the Daily Titan and need 2 participants to do a short interview to share how this exhibition impacted them and what they gained from it. So if you'd like to help her out below, please drop your email. Oh, so I guess that's for the students. So if you'd like to talk to the Daily Titan about Mark, and I can't say thank you enough. You've been just so generous with the stories and your time, and it's fascinating to hear all of your backgrounds and your work with community. I think that so often art education doesn't acknowledge that component and that part of that's core to our curriculum and core to what it means to be an art educator. So I really appreciate you talking about all of those things today and being so generous answering questions as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
So Mary and Mark, if we can meet right after, but I also want to thank you, Mark. There is a quote that you had said today that you once have told me back in the day when I worked at the California Museum of Photography when I first met you. And that quote was, and is, if art doesn't bother you, then it's not doing its job. And that's how I've learned to navigate the art world. Thank you so much, Mark.
I love that. I wrote that down too.
Thank you everyone for joining us. And if you need more information on Mark Stephen Greenfield, you can visit his website at markstephengreenfield.com. And again, thank you, Mark, for sharing a wealth of knowledge, the richness of your stories, and for sharing such powerful and poignant work with us. And for everyone, until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, look, it's nice to see who's here. Hi, the Karen Rapp is here. It's like interesting to see.
The whole gang's here.
I know, the whole gang's here. It's awesome.
Michelle's here. It's like romper room. Michelle's here. John's here. Rebecca Treywick was here as well.
I saw that. Yeah, it's cool.
Hey, everybody. Hey. Wonderful talk, Mark. Thank you. I'm going to be in touch with you soon, by the way.
Okay.
Bye, everybody. Hi, John.
our chair, Jay Jewett, was here too, and she
Got
wanted to know what was the name of that chair that you worked with, Mark, at Cal State Fullerton, or the person you worked with?
At Cal State Fullerton?
Yeah, you had mentioned earlier there was someone that you worked with,
Frank Cummings III.
Frank Cummings III.
Yeah,
Okay.
he started off teaching at Cal State Long Beach, and then he came over to Cal State Fullerton and became the chair.
Oh, okay, great.
Had to be in the, I think it was in the early 70s.
Okay, I'll let her